Hi everyone. How's it going? This is a huge crowd. I thought everyone's going to be home by now. Thank you so much for sticking around and checking out my talk. This is awesome. Really happy to see you all here. My name is Joe Grandja, and I'm with Pivotal. I work with Pivotal. I'm on the Spring Security team, and I've been heavily focused on the whole OAuth space and OpenID Connect and all the extension specifications built on top of OAuth and JWT and the Jose framework. And this presentation, next generation OAuth support in Spring Security 5. What does this mean, next generation OAuth support? I mean, OAuth has been around within the Spring portfolio projects for the last few years. I mean, as you guys are probably already aware, and girls, I say guys and girls, right? As you're aware, like we do have the Spring Security OAuth project. It's been around for 5 or 6 years, right? That's strictly OAuth 2 support. Doesn't have OpenID Connect support. We also have Spring Social. We have OAuth built into Spring Boot, 1.5 that is, and Boot 2, but the new OAuth support, and I'll get to that in a bit. And we also have Spring Cloud Security, and these 4 projects, right? We have these 4 projects with different bits of OAuth features built into them, right? And as a user, you might be asking yourself, okay, I got some OAuth features I need, right, within my application based on my requirements, my security requirements within my organization, the project that I'm working on. Which project do I choose within the Spring Portfolio project, right? Which one do I choose? It could be confusing, right? So about a year and a half ago, we sat down and we figured, okay, where is OAuth going within Spring, right? Are we going to continue to build Spring Security OAuth, or are we going to, do something else, right? So what we decided, just to avoid the confusion, I mean, it'd be a lot more simpler if you could just choose one project. If you need OAuth, OpenID Connect support, or JWT or Jose, you go to one project and it provides everything. I mean, that would be a lot easier, wouldn't it, right? So that's what we decided. Instead of continuing and build on Spring Security OAuth, we decided, okay, you know what, we're going to start fresh. So a year and a half ago, we started doing research, figuring out, okay, what did we do that was good? What did we do that was not so good? And what other libraries, Java libraries that are out there, we conducted our research. We figured out which other libraries are out there that are doing the good stuff, because we ultimately want to take all that good stuff and build from there and keep building, right? So we conducted some research, and then we started, right? We started the rewrites, and in Spring Security 5, which was introduced in late November, we introduced the first OAuth support, client-side support, and we're as we speak right now, we're building resource server support, which is targeted for 5.1, and then after that, we'll add authorization server support. What that means with Spring Security OAuth project is eventually that will be retired. Other projects, Spring Social will get retired, and with Spring Boot 2, all the OAuth support actually has been removed, right? And the new OAuth support within Spring Security 5 has been added to Spring Boot 2. So this is a huge undertaking. It's a long process, but it's super exciting, right? It's super exciting because OAuth, OpenID Connect, critical security protocol these days, and we need better support built into Spring. Not just OAuth, we need OpenID Connect, JWT, Jose, and all these extension specification. It is no doubt overwhelming. So our ultimate mission is to make OAuth easy, right? Which is not going to be easy, but we're gonna make that happen. So, and hopefully with this demo that I'm going to show you today, OAuth 2 login, hopefully it is easy for you. The feedback has been great so far, but I definitely want to hear from you guys if you guys are having any issues with it or if it's challenging. That's what I want to hear. I don't really want to hear if it's good. I want to hear if there's issues, because we want to make it easy, simple as that, right? So that's the background story behind next generation OAuth support. Before I even get into this, like, I literally have 2 slides. This is like the second slide. It's just going to be a demo. I'm going to show you the code. We're going to do some demo. We're going to get things working. I'm going to show you how to use it ultimately, right? But this is basically what we're going to go through. Is we're going to first So like I mentioned in Spring Security 5, the first major feature was OAuth 2 login. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. But in the end, it's as simple as, you go to those websites, log in with Facebook, log in with Google. That is OAuth 2 login. Whether it's OpenID Connect or with a standard OAuth 2 provider, it's OAuth 2 login, the general feature name. What I'm going to show you here is using UAA. The first demo is going to be using UAA. I got a local UAA, which is Cloud Foundry's identity management system. I just got that set up locally because I can't rely on the internet here for an OAuth provider, although we are going to try Google as a second one. But the first one is going to be Spring Boot 2 Complete Configuration. Complete configuration, when I say complete, I mean all the Spring Boot 2 specific supported properties, right? All of them, I'm going to outline them all and talk about each one and what they mean, and we're going to do that first step. And then the second step is Google. Okay, now that I've authenticated with Google or UAA, let's try Google. Let's see how quickly we could stand up another authentication, another provider for authenticating within our application. We'll use Google, but within Google, we'll show the minimal configure. What's the absolute minimal properties I need to set up to be able to connect to Google, to authenticate with Google within my application. And then the third part is Java configuration. So if you're not using Spring Boot, which I hope you are, because man, it makes my life easier, write less code, right? But if you aren't, for whatever reason, you could still leverage this with pure Java configuration. So I'm going to show you the equivalent of that, right? So now that we've authenticated and we've identified ourselves with the system, the next thing is enabling finer-grained authorization, because ultimately I represent an identity within the system, and I have certain authorities or certain access rights within the endpoints. So how do we enable finer grain authorization, ultimately map user authorities for that authentication, right? Do I have access to this endpoint or that endpoint? How do we do that within the OAuth 2 login feature? So that's the authorization piece. And then the third part I'm going to demo is, well, with OAuth 2 login, ultimately when I go through the authorization code grant flow, because that's how OAuth 2 login has been implemented using that grant type, is at the end result of that, there's an access token, right? So how can I get that access token as a user and ultimately use it to make a protected resource call to the user info endpoint? So I'm going to talk about that. And if there's enough time, I'm going to talk about this new feature that's currently in master. It's available in a snapshot build. It's going to come out in 5.1. So I'm going to demo that as well, hopefully, if there's enough time. So before I even get into the demo, I want to just gauge the audience. Is who here has been using Spring Security for at least a couple of years? Please raise your hand. Awesome. Okay, that's why you're all here. Who has used OAuth 2 login? Okay, great. Okay, so I mean, who's intimately familiar with OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect here? Okay, right on. Okay, one last question is, who is not having fun with the OAuth 2 login feature? Okay, I want to talk to you. All of you, come and see me after, because I want to make sure you're happy about this, right? So yeah, definitely come and see me. But it's too bad I got too many hands there, but that's okay. We got a ways to go still. Okay, so let's jump into this demo here. Actually, even before that, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna start the demo up. I'm just gonna show you the authentication piece, and then we're gonna go through the code and just get familiar with all the properties and so forth. Okay, so default login page. You'll never use this in production, but the default login page, I have one client registered. I'm going to show you the properties file, and we'll see that mapping there. But I just got one link here, UAA. All right, I'm going to click on this. I'm just going to authenticate, and I'll get into the details after I authenticate here. Okay, your typical consent screen, right? Do you authorize this specific OAuth client application or OAuth application, OAuth 2 login demo, to access these scopes or these pieces of protected resources, right? Email profile, right? So I'm going to authorize. So now I'm authenticated. I got these pieces of information here just displaying, right? So we have this unique identifier, which represents the claim, right? This is a standard claim defined within JWT and used within quite a few of the different specifications, OpenID Connect being one of them, and this is ultimately a unique identifier of myself, Joe, registered with UA, the provider, right? And there's this issuer claim, ISS claim. So the issuer claim and the subject claim is ultimately a globally unique identifier of me within this particular UA instance, right? So that's the unique identifier there. And then I have this logical name UAA, right? Now let's take a look. What did it take for me to be able to authenticate using OAuth too long? What did I have to do, right? Let's take a look at that. So here we go. This is my properties file. So the base property path is Spring Security OAuth 2 client registration, right? That's the base property path. And now right below registration, we have one or more client registrations, because within Spring Security 5, you can configure more than one client, right? Within Spring Security OAuth, you can only configure one, although there's ways to configure more than one. But as far as the Spring Boot specific properties go, you can only configure one, the standard properties. Now within Spring Security 5, you could configure multiple client registrations, because your application, you might want to have give the user to be able to authenticate with Facebook and Google, right? But also, after you authenticate, maybe you want to have another GitHub client where you want to display your GitHub repositories, for example. So you would have 3 clients configured, right? So you have this flexibility. But in this case, I got 1 client configured, right? So let's go through this right now. We have client registration UAA, right? That's just a logical name, right? Can everyone see that, by the way, back there? Yeah, sure. Here, I'll close this up. How's that? Is that better back there? Perfect. Okay. Okay. So that registration and then UAA. UAA, that's literally just a logical name. I could have called that UAA-login, right? It's just a logical name that you would assign. But this is a key piece. This represents the client registration ID. And the client registration ID is used throughout the framework classes to specifically reference a client registration. Now, what is a client registration? I mean, it represents a client registered with a provider. Simple, right? As the name implies, right? This is obviously a subset of information that's registered at the provider. The provider, when you go to Google and you register a client, there's a lot of registration metadata that you could add. But this is just a subset that we need for OAuth 2 login in our OAuth client application. So let's talk about each one. So we have client ID, client secret, right? Those are obviously the client credentials. With the authorization code grant, basically there's a 2-step process, right? When we ended up with that consent screen, what happens is the client redirects the user to the authorization endpoint of the provider, right? And at that step of the process, the provider asks the user, do you authorize this client or this OAuth application to access your resources, as you saw there, right? And it would give the OAuth application name. Do you allow it to access the profile information, right? Which would ultimately retrieve your email and your name and this kind of information. And then the end user will click authorize, and at that point, the authorization server provides an authorization grant. In this case, because it's the authorization code grant, it gives an authorization code, which is a temporary credential that the OAuth client exchanges for an access token, right? And this is where the client credentials come in, client ID, client secret. This is a confidential client, and because it's on the server, it could store the credentials on the server securely, right? And at that point, when it receives the authorization grant, or the authorization code in this case, it calls the token endpoint, authenticates with the authorization provider with these credentials. These credentials is ultimately what you get when you register a client. When you register a new client, you get client ID, client secret, right? So that's what those two are. Client authentication method, this comes back to when the client authenticates with token endpoint, it's authenticated using HTTP basic, right? So we have HTTP basic support and form post at the moment. And then authorization grant type, authorization code. That's how OAuth 2 login is implemented, using that grant type. And then we have the redirect URI template. Now this is a key parameter because at the point where the user authorize the client, the authorization server will redirect back to the redirect URI, right? And this is ultimately where the OAuth client application receives the authorization grant, the authorization code, to be able to use that on the back channel to call the token endpoint. So this is one of those parameters, one of those settings. When you're registering your client, you register your redirect URI, right? And this is just a template here, base URL, just host, port, scheme. And then we have this standard pattern, login, OAuth 2 code, and then registration ID. So this is just a standard pattern that the default pattern for the redirect for OAuth 2 login. This could be configured, this could be customized, but this is the default one. And as you can see, there's also another URI variable, registration ID. As I was mentioning earlier, this is a key parameter because this ultimately, when it comes back to OAuth 2 code /UAA, because this is the registration ID over here, then this authorization grant is for this client. That's how it knows, right? It's for this specific client to exchange and get an access token for this client. And then scope. Scope here, we have OpenID, standard scope for OpenID Connect. Now this is a required scope. This basically, if you don't have the OpenID Connect scope, then basically it's authorization code flow. Standard OAuth 2 authorization code. But if you put an OpenID to an OpenID provider, then it's actually an authentication request. And the result of the token endpoint is you get an ID token with an OpenID Connect authentication. I'm going to talk about that a little bit as we move forward. And then we have profile and email. Give me some profile information as in first name, last name, and then email, right? And this ultimately, all of this comes back when I specify my scopes and then I access the user info endpoint with this access token that has these scopes attached, then this information comes back. This protected resource information comes back, right? And then ultimately, Spring Security is able to authenticate the user with all this information. I can display my name up there and so forth. And ultimately, the claim ID, right? As you saw, that unique identifier. And the client name here is this, once again, this is like description field. This is just used in certain scenarios. One of them being the default login page, right? We display UAA there, and this could be used in other places, or it could never, doesn't have to be used, but we use this specifically in the login page. It's just the description field for that specific client registration. So we have everything. So this is the client-specific registration information, and then we have provider, right? So as you can see, it's the same, right? UAA, the client registration ID. So we have registration provider, and then we can have multiple client registrations below the registration and multiple below the provider, right? Now we have the core protocol endpoints that OAuth 2 defines, which is the authorization endpoint and the token endpoint, and also the redirection endpoint, right, where the client receives the authorization grant. But that's defined up there at the redirect URI template. So we have the authorization, the token endpoint, the user info URI. So this is the user info endpoint, because with OAuth 2 login, I mean, the authorization code, I mean, OAuth 2, it's about authorization. It's not about authentication, right? Unless you're using OpenID Connect, then it's authentication, because the difference there is when the OAuth client exchanges that authorization grant for the access token, what also comes back is the ID token. So at that point, I could authenticate the user because I have the ID token, which is basically the authentication information of the user at the provider. But for a standard OAuth 2 provider like GitHub, for example, I don't have that information. I just have an access token, and ultimately I need to call the user info endpoint to be able to get user information and ultimately authenticate the user within Spring Security. right? So the user info endpoint here, I mean, it's defined by OpenID Connect. It is not part of OAuth 2, right? But enable to support OAuth 2 login, and this is why we've given it this generic name, is you could authenticate with either an OpenID Connect provider or a standard OAuth 2 provider. It doesn't matter, right? However, if you're connecting with a standard OAuth 2 provider like GitHub or Facebook, because they're not OpenID Connect compliant, then that third step in the OAuth 2 login process, because I was talking about the first is the authorization process, then it's exchanging the access token, the authorization grant for the access token. That third step, which is part of the OAuth 2 login feature, that third step is calling the user info endpoint to get the user information using that access token that was granted on that second step, right? So that's the user info endpoint. And obviously with GitHub or like Facebook, they all have user endpoints. You just have to figure out what it is with their APIs, but they all have it, right? You basically, it just retrieves whatever attributes of the currently authenticated user, right? And then we have the username attribute name. This is basically, this is the attribute that comes back on the user info endpoint that uniquely identifies that user. So here I have sub, which is the subject claim. As I was talking about earlier, that is the unique identifier of the user. However, with GitHub, for example, because GitHub is not OpenID Connect provider, they actually don't have a subject claim. So there's a little bit extra configuration you got to do here. With GitHub, I believe it's actually just ID. Right? So for GitHub, if I was configuring GitHub client, that username attribute would be ID. Why do we got to do this? Well, within Spring Security, the get principal, it has to be unique, right? So we need to be able to have a unique identifier to identify the authentication within Spring Security, right? The JwkSetURI, so this is used for OpenID Connect clients. The ID token that comes back, it's signed, right? So the client has to verify that signature. The way it verifies that signature is it calls JwkSetURI, which is JSON Web Keys. It's basically providers expose public keys that clients can fetch and use to verify the signature. So that's what that parameter is. So that's it. That's literally, those are all the Spring Boot 2 specific properties, right? So that's that part of the demo. Now I'm going to show you, I mean, that's a lot of properties, right? Like, how am I going to remember that? Like, it would be a lot simpler if I didn't have to specify all of them. So let's see what we could do here to make it even simpler. Let's set up Google. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to register a Google client here. Hopefully the internet's going to work for me here. So this is, I mean, if you wanted to set up authentication with any provider, I mean, you got to go to Facebook Developer Console or Google Identity Platform, and you set up your OAuth client. So I'm here on Google. I'm going to set up a new client here. I'm just going to do this quickly. We don't have to get into too much of the details here of how this is done, because every provider, it's different. Sorry? Yeah, I could do that. How's that? So as I was mentioning here, like with every provider, really, the key parameter is your redirect URI, right? And with Google, it's in this field here, authorize redirect URI, and we're going to use the standard pattern, auth2 code, and then Google. So see here, Google. I'm giving the client registration ID Google. I could call this anything. Okay, I'll just say Google login. All right. Actually, I'm going to keep it Google, but this is ultimately what I'm naming the client registration ID. So I'm going to create this. And then what comes back here is my client credentials, right? So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go into my application YAML, and I'm going to configure another client. And the client secret. Come back here. Okay. So that's it for what I did on this application. I literally just added a new client registration, right? Under registration, Google. I'm going to leave UA there so you can see what it looks like on the login page. And I added client ID, client secret. That was it. I didn't add anything else, right? Let's start this up and let's see what happens. I'm going to start a new window here. So I got 2 now, right? Let me just zoom this in. So I got 2, right? Displaying Google UA. So now I have that typical case, you know, like in Stack Overflow, for example, there's 2 options, you know, register myself or log in with Facebook, log in with Google. So now I could log in with this application, I could log in with Google or UAA. Let's try it out. Let's make sure it works. So I'm going to click on this, and I get redirected to Google. I got to log in. And there I am, right? I'm authenticated now with Google, right? And you're probably wondering why I didn't get the consent screen there. Google, every provider implements things differently, right? Not all providers will display that consent screen. Google happens to not, if you have the OpenID Connect scope, that is. So as you can see here, there's my my unique identifier with Google. That's the subject claim, right? And then I'm at my OAuth client, Google, right? Where's this information coming from? This, especially this Google one, right? Like I didn't enter that. I just entered client ID, client secret. That was all I entered, right? Just to prove it out, I'll go to my display user info. This is actually accessing my user info endpoint at Google and displaying my information that's registered with Google, right? So it was literally that simple, right? I literally added client ID, client secret, right? Now, how did that work? Well, we provide sensible defaults for 4 providers: Google, Facebook, GitHub, and Okta, right? Literally in this class here, for example. You know, I'm kind of digging in here, but you know, we have Google, GitHub, Facebook, and Okta. Now, we provide these defaults because for OAuth 2 login, like it's all, that information doesn't change very often, that is. Like, I mean, the scopes will not change. It's always going to be OpenID and, you know, profiling email. The authorization endpoint and token endpoint, I mean, they'll rarely change, but they are versions, so they will change. However, we could still use the older endpoints. They're still going to work, right? And you know, we specify default for client name Google. So for these 4 providers, we just provide sensible defaults because these are pretty much like, you know, standard providers. And for you to have to add all that information over and over again, it's kind of redundant, right? So those 4 providers, you literally enter your client ID, client secret, and you're done, right? So that's it. You know, that's how quickly I stood up Google. Registered a client with Google. I got my client ID, client secret. I had the client credentials to my application YAML, and I'm done, right? Now I could use my app to authenticate with Google, right? So the next thing I want to show is if you're not using Spring Boot 2, right, and you still want to leverage OAuth 2 login, how does this look like? What do I got to do? I'm going to show you the equivalent Java configuration. Got this cut and paste here. And I'm going to go over some of the core components that are used so you can get more familiar with them. And then I'm going to grab the credentials here. And I will go over this as soon as I do my cut, copy, and paste. Okay, let's make this bigger. And I'm going to close this over here. So this is the equivalent Java configuration. So you guys are all familiar with, the web security configure adapter, and then you're configuring the builder, HTTP security, right? If you want to enable OAuth 2 login, this is literally all you got to do. You just got to call the configurer, OAuth 2 login, and you're done. There's quite a bit of configuration points within the OAuth 2 login configurer, but that's if you're getting more into the, customizing. If you want just the default OAuth 2 login with no configuration like I just did with Google, this is all you got to do, OAuth 2 login, and you're done. However, where does all that client registration information come from? Because I was defining it in my Spring Boot properties. I'm not using Spring Boot, so where's it going to come from? So this is the equivalent, is you define, one or more client registrations, and they're composed within a client registration repository, right? So let's look at a client registration. This is all the same information, right? So we have client registration with registration ID. So I defined a registration ID, and then using the Fluent Builder, I just set all my properties. And as you can see, these are all the same properties, right, that are in Spring Boot 2. This is exactly what Spring Boot 2 auto configuration does. It does exactly what this code is showing here right now. So I configure all my properties. I'm not going to go over all of those because we already did. But as soon as I create one or more client registrations, then I got to compose them within a client registration repository. I happen to be just using the in-memory client registration repository here, and I'm exposing it as a bean because the way OAuth 2 login works is it looks for a specific client registration repository, right? Now this could come back, this could be your own client registration repository implementation that looks for your client registration data in a database, for example, or it could be calling another service to get the data. Whatever it is, ultimately you need to register a client registration repository interface, bean, right? And the interface is pretty simple. There's not much to it. Find by registration ID, all right? That registration ID, that logical name that you define it, right? So that's literally the equivalent, right? So enable OAuth 2 login, right, on the HTTP security builder, and then create, or look up one or more client registrations wherever that is within your system, and then aggregate that within a client registration repository. So let's try this out. Let's see if this still works. I'm gonna, just to prove it, I'll get rid of the properties here. Okay, and we'll start this up. Start up a new window. As you can see, there's just one now. Before we had two with UAA. There's Google. Let's log in. And I'm logged in. All right. Display my user info, and there it is. So there it is, right? So even the Java configuration wasn't too complicated, right? You're very familiar with HTTP security, dot form login, dot OAuth 2 login. It's the same thing, right? You just the key thing here is you just need to register a client registration repository bean. That's it. Everything else will just work, right? So that's it for the authentication piece. So I've authenticated with the system. Now, by default, OAuth 2 login, it just sets a default authority, role user, That's it, right? Now that's not too useful in any enterprise application. You want to be able to, enable finer grained authorization checks. The only way to do that within Spring Security is you have to set up the authorities for that current authentication. Right now, we'll just have regular user or user, right? So what we're going to jump into next is authority mapping, custom authority mapping. So let's, are there any questions before we kind of jump to the next one? Everyone's good? Everyone understands everything? Yeah? Okay, cool. Let's, I'm gonna check out a branch here. So I got these two branches, authorities mapping, and got that other branch with the new features that I'm going to show you guys in a bit. Okay, let's start this up, and I'm just going to show you the demo quickly, and then we can get into the code and see how that all works. Oh yeah, I got to import the changes here. Okay. Okay, we're all started up here. Let's start up. Okay, let me log in, and then I'll just do a quick demo of demonstrating the authorization. Okay, so authorize. Okay, let's make this bigger. Okay, there's some more information here. This is not a pretty UI, but I want to demonstrate, right, that we actually have enabled, finer grained authorization within this application, right? So we have the top there, we have default authorities, role user. As I was mentioning with OAuth 2 login, your default authority, if you're not doing any authorities mapping, is role user, right? But I got some code in here where I am, I plugged in a custom granted authorities mapper, and I'm gonna demonstrate. We're gonna look at the code where I've actually mapped to this, the current user to these authorities: create message, read message, update message, delete message. It's a standard messaging application, right? I could do the typical CRUD stuff, right? And then I got the links on the bottom there to demonstrate, can I access those endpoints given my current authorities within my authentication, right? So let's take a look at that. So create message, as you can see the endpoint on the top, you probably can't, and there's no way I'm going to be able to expand that, but I could obviously create a message. I could also read a message, update, delete, right? But I have this other one here, manage message, and as you can see in my mapped authorities, I do not have that authority assigned to myself within the system. So if I hit this is what I expected, right? 403 forbidden, right? So I've enabled finer grained authorizations within my application because I've mapped custom authorities. So how did I do that with OAuth 2 login? Right, let's take a look at that. So let's look at the configuration here. I'm going to make this bigger. Actually, even before I jump to that, I'm going to show you what I set up for my user. So I'm using Spring Data here, and I just got this pre-populated. I'm logging in with, SpringSec 5, right? That's my unique identifier. Just imagine this application where there's a separate admin application where after I've logged in, a record gets added into my database. of my claim, my unique identifier, into the database. And now, I've registered that external user, Google user, within my local application here. And then there's another admin application. The admins use it to authorize or grant access to specific users and specific endpoints. So let's just imagine there's that admin application, and in that admitting application, I've happened to grant these authorities for SpringSec 5, right? So this is my default that I'm just kind of pre-populating so I could demonstrate that. But that's how your typical use case. Well, it's a common use case where you would have this admin application and you would grant certain access to a user, right? So as you can see, there's my pre-populated authorities. Now, within my security configuration, now you're familiar with setting up your ANT matchers. You should be using MVC matchers, by the way, if you are using Spring web controllers, because ultimately, if you're using ANT matchers, there's just sometimes it doesn't do the exact matching. So you want to use MVC matchers if you're using Spring AT controllers or REST controllers. So I got my authorization rule set up here. So for create message, I'm granting access to anyone who has this authority, right? Create message, right? And so forth. So this is pretty common if you've used Spring Security. Nothing new here. This is where the difference is, though, right? We have OAuth 2 login, and then we have user info endpoints, right? And as you can see, this DSL here, there are a few different configuration points. As I was talking about earlier, is there's 3 core protocol endpoints that OAuth 2 defines. The authorization endpoint, token endpoint, and the redirection endpoint, which is the client endpoint. And then within OpenID Connect, it defines the user info endpoint, right, where you get the user information, the protected resource within the provider. So we have these different endpoints: user info endpoint, token endpoint. These are all aligned with the protocol endpoints, and this is where you would configure different parts within those protocol endpoints. So obviously, if I'm doing user authorities mapping, it makes sense that we would provide that configuration under the user info endpoint. And so we have it here, right? User info endpoint, and the user authorities mapper, and this is the code right here. So granted authorities mapper, this is nothing new. This has been in Spring Security forever, right? It basically takes a collection of authorities and returns the mapped authorities, or unmapped, just returns the ones that came in, whatever that implementation decides to do, right? So I've just implemented that and I plugged it in. My implementation here is this Lambda expression. And ultimately, I'm not going to go through all of this, but ultimately what I'm doing here in this Lambda expression is I'm getting the email attribute that comes back from the user info endpoint, right? And I'm using that to look up my user information, my authority information within this user authority repository, right? And this just returns, those 4 user authorities that I've pre-populated in my database, right? Which is just this simple entity, right? An ID, user ID, so SpringSec 5, as you saw in that data SQL, and then the authority, create message, read message, and so forth. And then it comes back here with, the authorities that have been granted to me, and then ultimately I just convert those to simple granted authority instances, and a collection of those, right? Which is basically my mapped authorities, right? So that's the implementation. This could be anything. I could get authorities from a database. I could call a protected resource using the access token, wherever your authority information is, and it's different for every organization. That authority information, it could come in the ID token. It could come in the access token, which is not recommended. I mean, sometimes it's in there. Like if it's a JWT, you could have a custom claim, groups. It makes more sense that it would come in the ID token. However, every provider does things a bit differently. But the key thing is you have access to all this information within this one object here, OAuth 2 user authority, because this is ultimately what comes in as your default authority, as your default one authority, that role user. And in here we have, in here we have for the OpenID Connect one, because with UAA or Google, it'll be one of these instances, right? And then here I have my ID token and attributes from the user info endpoint. So I have everything I need here to be able to do my custom authority mapping. I'm really running out of time here. I got 5 minutes, and I really would like to show you this new feature because I do have time, and let's try to rip through this because this is a pretty powerful. And this is in, yeah, there we go. Okay. Auth code grant. Oh. Okay, so let's start this up right now. We'll import the changes. We'll start this up. So what I'm going to show right now is this is in master. You could play around with this in the snapshot build, but we've implemented the authorization code grant just without OAuth 2 login, right? Because OAuth 2 login leverages the authorization code grant, but you might want to set up your application for form login, but you want to be able to still create a client that fetches protected resources. This example is I'm going to show my GitHub repository. So I'm going to go through the authorization code grant with a client, and I'm going to basically fetch my GitHub repositories. I'm going to show you the code, how to set that up. Okay, we'll stop that because I didn't stop that. We'll run that. We'll start this over again. Okay, GitHub repositories. Well, first I will log in to the application using UAA. And then I want to see my GitHub repositories. Oh. So I guess I got, here we go. Okay. And then I'll go into, I got two-factor set up. Okay, that was it, right? So I had that client registration, I clicked on it, I logged in, and it fetched my repositories. I got all my repositories here, right? Now, what did I do from a code perspective, right? This is I think this is pretty sweet, and this is why I really wanted to show this to you guys. Is now my application YAML, I have an extra configuration, right, for GitHub. Right, my client ID, client credentials, I've already set this up before. The key thing is here, scope, public repo, right? Because I need that scope to access my public repositories just because I went to the API and it tells me what scopes I got to configure, so I put that in there, right? My redirect URI template, as you can see, it's different, and I'm going to show you the controller that does all that. And then the client name, that was it. That's all I had to do. I didn't have to specify the provider information because, like I said earlier, we provide the defaults, right? The authorization endpoint, the token endpoint, and so forth. That's all I had to do on my application YAML. Now, what displays all that information? And this is really what I wanted to show you. So here's my controller. It comes here. This OAuth 2 client annotation, right? So this here, as you can see, I got GitHub there. That's my registration ID, so that maps to that application YAML client registration. When it comes to this controller method, it tries to resolve to an OAuth 2 authorized client, right? And I'll talk about that in a bit. If it's not available, right, then it starts the authorization code flow, as you saw. I had to log in, then I had to authorize, and so forth. And then it redirects back to this controller, and now it's available, this OAuth 2 authorized client. What is this OAuth 2 authorized client? I mean, in the end, it's an association of a client, a user, and the end result of an access token. The end user is authorizing a client to access its protected resources. The end result of that authorization is an access token. So the OAuth 2 authorized client, it's an association of these three entities, right? And an OAuth 2 authorized client, you could fetch that from the OAuth 2 authorized client service, right? I'm not going to get too much into that because it looks like I'm already out of time, but the key thing here is that's all I had to do. That annotation, OAuth 2 client, and now I have my access token, right? So, and then over here, the only thing I'm doing in the web client is I have access to the access token, right? There's the access token right there, right? And then I just add that in authorization header over here, right? Your typical bearer scheme, right? Authorization header, bearer scheme, access token value, call the resource, right? And that's pretty much it for the new feature. So it's pretty sweet. I mean, the authorization code grant flow, complicated flow, right? This is all you got to do to ultimately get an access token set up and then use it to access the resources. The last thing, yeah, I'm totally done now, but what I'm going to put up here is I'm going to put up this slide. If you guys want to take a look at this code, that's the GitHub repo, the first one. And the second one is, there's a few samples actually. This one is the first OAuth 2 login sample. The one I just showed you right now, the GitHub's example with the new feature, that's in master. As you can see, this is 5.0 release. So if you want to look at that specific sample, the GitHub's controller with the OAuth 2 client annotation, you got to go to the master branch, okay? And then the login reference, there's a ton of documentation here. We are making sure that we're documenting every single feature, right, and providing samples so you guys have resources to check out, right? That's it. Thank you very much. As far as questions go,